It'll kick on. There it goes. Good evening. We welcome you to the temple for our Walk the Talk panel on immigration. We are honored to have our moderator, our panelists, our speakers, and all of our guests here with us. I'm Rabbi Shana Mackler. I am one of the rabbis here at the temple, and we are thrilled to present this panel. As a little bit of a setup, I want to share with you the context of what we're doing here tonight. This coming week, actually on the 30th, we will gather around our tables for our Passover Seder. We'll recount the story of our liberation and the blessings of freedom. And this time is a time to remember the miracle of our redemption, but also that the miracle of our redemption is not yet complete. We have much to do to ensure freedom and justice, equality, and respect in our community and in our world. This sacred congregation is proud to have a history deeply rooted in civil justice and the fight for civil rights and civil liberties. Even to this day, we work to heed the call of our Passover Seder. Let all who are hungry come and eat. Welcome the stranger, set free the captive, and recommit ourselves to march always toward justice, equality, freedom, and peace. Throughout our history and until this very day, as a people and as a congregation, we are keenly aware and grateful for those who took courageous steps forward to help along that journey. Those who didn't have to give us refuge, but opened their hearts and their homes. Those who risked their lives to save others, even strangers. Those who fought alongside and stood for and behind our community to ensure our protections, our rights, and our freedoms. And so everything that we do in the effort for civil justice reminds us how we might emulate those people who did the same for us, to bring honor to them and to our people. As people of faith, we have plenty of biblical mandates to encourage us to bring justice to this world, particularly to our immigrant community. We just have to walk the talk. A very wise woman once said to me, you can throw up your hands when confronted with the many serious issues and complexities facing us, or you can roll up your sleeves and take them on, but you can't do both at the same time. Throwing up our hands is not working. Many of us, particularly in this room, have already rolled up their sleeves, and others are here to learn how to do that too. At the temple, we are continuing to roll up our sleeves. Through our justice team, headed by Daniel Horowitz, our congregation has committed to Brit Olam, a covenant with our world. It is called that as a challenge for us to create a world we want, even as we struggle with the world as it is. Across North America and around the world, vulnerable populations, we know, face profound challenges. This initiative of Brit Olam comes from our Reform Jewish movement, and we are committed to meeting the urgency of now with moral leadership through congregational and community-based action, particularly centered around the issues of criminal justice, LGBT rights, and immigration. As we organize our community, we are grateful for those leaders and those agencies in our larger community doing that sacred work. As we learn about issues and advocacy and action we can individually take, but more importantly, collectively take, we can begin to move the needle. Harnessing our voices, harnessing our talents and our power can create that change that we want. And we at the temple are honored to be a part of that. In a few minutes, Daniel Horowitz will introduce our panel. But before that, we have the wonderful opportunity of hearing the stories, the journeys of two special people. It's my pleasure to invite Kassar Abdallah, Kurdish refugee and an advocate for refugee rights, to share with us her story, and then Julio Rodriguez to follow her, to share a bit about his journey as a student with DACA. Please welcome them.
First, I want to actually acknowledge all of you for being here on a freezing, chilly evening. So I thank you for being here. I also want to thank Daniel and the temple for really putting their vision and their mission and their Jewish values into action. I mean, it's really beautiful. It's one thing to talk about it, it's another to actually put those values into action. So I appreciate the opportunity for me to be here. Personal stories are difficult to share, especially when they're quite tragic. They're not easy to share. However, I don't think it's a privilege for me to be here to share it. I think it's a responsibility that I share it with you as my fellow brothers and sisters in humanity. So I want you to go on this journey with me. It's 1988. I'm 6 years old. Very excited little girl because I get to ride the family's donkey, not the pony because my parents think I'm still young. That donkey was really stubborn and slow. It would take forever for the donkey to travel to my uncle's house, who literally lived a few minutes away. But nonetheless, I was really excited that I was able and I was given the permission to ride the donkey. In addition to that, it was one of the most momentous years of my life because I get to start elementary school. That was the first year I was going to be a kindergartner. I bugged my mom constantly about when will I get my backpack so I could be like my big brother and sister who are constantly making me jealous that they can read and they can write and they're having so much fun at the school. I just dreamed of being a student. Unfortunately, in September of 1992, dawn turned into dusk. I heard the loudest noise knocking at the door. That knock changed the rest of my life. It was a Kurdish freedom fighter who had fled from the genocidal attack of the Ba'ath Party in Kurdistan of Iraq. He was the only survivor left, and so he made an attempt to make sure that he let as many villagers know as possible to flee into the mountains, because the only friends we have are the mountains. My mom at that time was pregnant, and she had 6 of us, all young. My father wasn't around. He was traveling. My grandmother was with her. And so she thought to herself, she looked at my grandma and she said, how about you take the kids and you move to the mountains, you hide in the mountains, in the caves, and I will meet you after that, because what if their father returns and he doesn't know what happened to us? And the Peshmerga looked at her and said, you have no idea what is happening. You cannot stay here. Do you see the smokes? That's Gestermas. Do you hear the sounds of bombs? You have to move. There's no guarantee that you will even see your husband. So you might want to save your children. And as a 6 years old, I had no idea. All I could ask is, what in the world just happened to my life? Yesterday I was riding on the donkey. Tomorrow I was expecting to be in school. And now I'm fleeing for my life. I have no idea where I'll end up with. I remember walking for days and nights. And the Peshmerga told us, you cannot stay in the mountains. They're also not your friends. They're not going to keep you safe. And so therefore we continued with thousands of people. Think about it, women and children. A refugee is taken by surprise. You're not given any opportunity to plan or pack your bags. The only thing you have are the clothes that you are wearing. And I remember crossing over the mountains that actually divide Kurdistan of Iraq from Kurdistan of Turkey. And so we fled from the hands of one enemy into the hands of other. Many of you may know or hear from the news that the city in Afrin, which is populated by Kurdish people, is facing massacres. And I remember going into the refugee camp. It was a deserted area. Nothing was there. And all of a sudden, before my eyes, I saw barbed wires and armed soldiers surrounding us, and we were all pushed into this camp. There were no tents. There was no access to water, no food. Then I saw tents being set up. And I kept crying and telling my mother, why can't I go home? I just want to go home. And she looked at me and she said, there is no home. So I lived 4 years in a refugee camp. My elementary life was in the refugee camp. I am forever thankful to my mom and some of the civic leaders who were brave enough to say, you know what? We're not sure how much longer we'll be in this refugee camp. Therefore, we will begin to set up underground secret schools to teach Kurdish kids how to read and write Kurdish. It was one of the best things that actually happened to my life. I remember going on science experiments with my teachers who would help me understand the colors of the earth. And she would say, we're going to go on a science experiment. We're going to dig the earth and we're going to make chalks so I could use it in the classroom. And she said, if you can dig enough, you're going to notice the different shades in the earth the way you see the shades in people's faces. And she was right. I remember my mother taking the nutrition label of cans and taking it off, and that was my piece of paper. I remember using charcoal to use as my pencil and sharpening it up. I remember my father sharpening up different sticks, and I would use the soil as my notebook and practice the Kurdish alphabets, but I was taught to be careful when you hear, smell, or a soldier walking up that you immediately cover it up because they must not know that you are studying a forbidden language in that part. My mother knew that she risked my life by sending me to school, but she thought it would be better for my soul to be liberated through education and knowledge, even though I was physically caged into the harshest inhumane conditions. She thought it would be worth it for me to be educated than to be uneducated, because education is true freedom to one's soul. After 4 years of living there, I remember it was 1992. We got this wonderful news that came to us. We were the chosen ones in the refugee camp. We were chosen and selected by the Refugee Resettlement Program to come and be settled in the United States. We had different emotions, mixed emotions. We did not want it to come here, quite honestly. My parents wanted to go back home. If you know the political area of that time, United States betrayed the Kurdish people. We asked them to uprise against Saddam Hussein, and we will back them up. And we withdrew our troops. My parents were terrified that if they come to the United States, we would be in the hands of another enemy. On the other side, we had family members who said, no, but I have heard of the American dream. It is the land of opportunity. It is the land of freedom. It is where every human being can have the right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. That dream, that America's utopia, I actually believed it at the age of 10. So I was so excited to come to the United States. And so in 1996, out of the 50 states in the United States, my family was settled in Fargo, North Dakota. Not sure if you've been up north, but it gets cold. Much colder than what you feel outside. I mean, they were below zero freezing weather. I remember being handed down snowsuits that I would have to wear, head to toe covered up, just to be able to bear the weather. The conditions were hard, but my family also had the challenges and difficulties of integrating. We were told that you have 90 days to start a new life in your adopted country. 90 days is when refugee services end. In 90 days, you have to get a job, put kids in school. I also noticed that life was dominated by paperwork, which was one of the greatest struggles for my parents, who both were illiterate. And so at the age of 10, I was handed documents after documents to read and translate and write, from registering me and my siblings into the school system to learning how to write bills at the age of 10. Then my father was actually billed for the airline tickets that brought us to the United States. Some said this is a perfect reality check of life in America. It's a good opportunity to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. But then I questioned, what if you don't have boots? And so North Dakota, there were struggles. But what I will never forget the day I landed in the airplane. Off the airplane into the airport. I met this elderly woman, very petite woman, gray hair. She just walked up to me. And at that time, I was terrified. I was holding on to my mother's dress, along with my other siblings. We're all like pulling on her to different sides. We were terrified because we were surrounded by curious eyes. There were reporters taking pictures of us. There were people just wondering why we were there. I'm sure some people were even cussing at us. Refugees are burdening us. I'm sure things were happening. The good thing is we didn't understand anything, so we kept smiling. And this lady walked up to me. She knew the fear in my eyes. She felt it. She handed a stuffed animal to me, and she had the world's biggest smile on her face. It wasn't that I was interested in the stuffed animal as much as the smile that she gave me. That smile warmed up the rest of the airport for me. I'm so glad she was the first American I met. It changed my perception of who are Americans, and it changed my perception of my adopted nation. Unlike some of the recent refugees who are being settled today, they're not getting the same compassion that I received. I will never forget my teachers who had so much hope in me, who stayed extra hours to tutor me. And literally in less than a year, I became the community interpreter for our 10 Kurdish families who were settled in Fargo, North Dakota. From 1992 to 1996, it was harsh. My family didn't choose Fargo, North Dakota, but we definitely decided to leave the snow and land for the heat of Nashville, Tennessee in 1996, and it was July. No one told us not to come here in July. No, I missed the memo on that one. The reason why my parents actually chose Nashville, Tennessee, there were many. One, there was already an established Kurdish community here. There were ethnic markets. My parents were so excited to find good, clean grape leaf wraps so you can make dolmas to some of the special spices. My mother felt like she was in heaven. On the other side, they were able to find low-skilled jobs. They were able to connect with the community. They actually had some of the same values as Tennessee had. Love your neighbor, get connected to your neighbors, the spirit of volunteerism. And there were just so many values. And of course, not to mention the landscape. Even though our weather, I really feel like it's bipolar. It's getting me confused. But the fact that the mountains and the valleys and the trees reminded them of Kurdistan. They were excited to know that they can actually grow pomegranates in the backyard, and they grew fig trees. And this was a source of joy for them, and it connected them to their traditions, something that they can pass on to their grandkids. So fast forward. Now went to middle school, went to high school, went to graduate school and postgraduate school. Life's been very interesting. It's been a roller coaster. But what has made me most successful and has actually one of the major reasons why I'm here today, standing in front of you, are because I've been surrounded by supportive mentors. I have been surrounded by teachers, community supporters that have gained their energy, that I've recharged my love and my compassion towards just humanity. Even though it is quite difficult, I'm not going to be dishonest with you that life is challenging for a young Muslim girl growing up in Nashville, Tennessee, the Bible Belt. It is tough, it is challenging. But I have learned over the years that every single challenge that I face is only an opportunity for me to better myself and my fellow human being that I'm facing with. I cannot not mention the crisis our world is facing. We have 65 million displaced people around the world. That is a huge crisis. It is as much of my responsibility as every single one of you in this building. It is our responsibility in how we take care of our environment, to how we take care of our people. Because, like Desmond Tutu said, for I can only be human. My humanity is bound up in yours. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you. Okay. Works. Hello, my name is Julio Rodriguez, as mentioned before. Uh, Me and my family were originally from Mexico, and we originally moved here back in 1998. And the reason why was because this is the land of opportunity. Back where my parents are from, opportunity is somewhat limited, just due to many reasons. But pretty much, both of my parents were really good in school, from what I hear. Uh, Sadly, they were both only able to make it to the sixth grade. Then, if they wanted to proceed, they had to pay to go to school. That's even further, and that's money that my grandparents didn't have, and they also needed them at home to help out with typical duties. So once my parents grew up and they had my older brother, and then later me, they realized that they wanted more for us, more than what they would be able to have. So they made the decision to move to Nashville. Um, and then they came here uh, the only way they could at the time. So they came here undocumentedly uh, with me and my older brother. And then growing up here in Nashville, it was okay. We had like a pretty big community, or big enough community where we could feel somewhat at home. And then we grew up here. We started going to school here in Metro. We started at Haywood Elementary, which is located in Antioch. And then growing up, my parents often stressed the importance of an education because that is the primary reason they brought us here. And it's something they often told us that that's something they wish they could do. They wish they could go to school for free, like for 12, 13 years. So that's what we did. Me and my brother both excelled. Uh, I was actually able to go to Hume Fogg for high school. And as I was going to Hume Fogg, I realized that my classmates at the time, like around sophomore year, they were able to get their driver's license, which is a really big deal back in the day. And then when I wanted to get my driver's license, my brother kind of like told me, "You kind of can't. Me and you, we can't because we're undocumented." And that's kind of like the first time I realized what it meant and what I couldn't do. So I couldn't get my driver's license. I couldn't drive myself around. I couldn't get a job to help out with my family, at least not a legal job. And even less, I couldn't get to that job because I can't drive. So that was definitely a downer, um, especially at 16. But luckily in 2012, President Obama issued an executive order called Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And that was kind of our light at the end of the tunnel. And with this program, it allowed students like me, like my older brother, like thousands of Tennesseans, it allows us to be able to get a work permit, to get our driver's license and work legally. So we were definitely excited. However, that was a non-permanent solution to an even bigger problem. So that was back in 2012. We had to pay $465, go through a lot of paperwork to prove that we've been here for as long as we've been here. Biometrics exam, background checks, kind of like to prove that we're good people, as we say we were. And things started looking up. I was about to be 18, so then I could finally start driving. I could finally go to work, get a job. So then around 18, I was focused on on going to college, and that's also kind of another little roadblock where undocumented students in Tennessee aren't eligible for in-state tuition, despite going to school for however many years you went here. I can't go to UTK and pay the same rates as my graduating peers. I can't go to Nashville State Community College and pay the same as my peers. I would have to pay either out-of-state rates or international rates, which can be 2 to 3 times as much. And seeing as to how I barely started working at 18, that's a lot to pay. So then, despite feeling down, I came in contact with Turk. And then I was there when we launched the tuition equality bill, which would allow students like me to be able to pay in-state tuition at public universities. It doesn't help with federal aid or state aid, which I still don't qualify for, but it will be a step in the right direction. Um, that still hasn't passed. It's 2018, and we introduced it to the legislator this year again, and it passed the first subcommittee, but we're still waiting on hopefully more good news. And even though I wasn't able to get into state a state school, I was fortunate enough to be able to make it to Lipscomb University, where I currently am now, and pretty much where I'm able to like speak to people, outreach, and let them know the struggle that is being undocumented, which is being a DACA recipient, and pretty much the struggles we face despite it not seeming like a problem to some people, because a lot of us were told to be quiet about it. You can't get in trouble. You can't let anyone know, because you never know what can happen. And as of right now, I'm pretty hopeful that it's gonna pass this year. Um, that's pretty much it. Thank y'all. Thank y'all for your time.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, Kassar. Thank you, Julio, for sharing those stories. My name is Daniel Horowitz, and I chair the Temple's new Social Justice Committee. Before we begin, I have a couple of very quick announcements. First, please silence your cell phones. Secondly, if anyone wants more information about any of the organizations that are here tonight, we have tables set up outside with some literature available. We also have voter registration forms available in case anyone needs to register to vote. There will also be a few minutes for Q&A at the end of this program, so if you have any questions that you'd like answered, please write them down on a note card and we'll collect them at the end and give them to the panel. And now, without further ado, I'd like to invite our panelists to come up and join us on stage. Introduce them very briefly. Joining us tonight, we have 4 incredible local advocates for immigrants and refugees. First, we have Leah Hashinger from TURC, the Tennessee Immigrant and Refugee Rights Coalition. Second, we have Wade Mundy from Tennessee Justice for Our Neighbors, or JFON. Third, we have Jenny Pupo-Walker from Conexión Americas. And fourth, we have Mary Catherine Harcombe from the Nashville Public Defender's Office. Finally, to moderate our panel tonight, we have a woman who needs no introduction in this town, my dear friend, mentor, and the greatest news anchor in the history of Nashville.
Great. That's all we do. Well, panel, let's talk day-to-day life. In your view, what's the most important challenge that immigrants and refugees in Nashville face on a daily basis, and what sort of concrete programs or reforms can really make a difference?
Didn't realize I was sitting in the first seat.
Yep.
So I think the basic, well, two sets of things I want to talk about briefly. One is, as our speakers both have mentioned, most immigrants and refugees are very low income when they first come. Just this past week, I've had 2 clients who are recent refugees who've said, no, what I really need is housing. Can you find me a place to live? So this group of people has many of the same needs as, frankly, many of my other clients who are also low income, but that's housing and transportation. So I just want to put that out there that everybody needs those things, not just sort of the people we think of. Specific things, so what I do at the Public Defender's Office is I improve our representation of our non-citizen clients. So minor crimes like possession of marijuana, domestic assault, which can be a slap, it can be a push, can result in deportation of people who have lawful permanent residence. Just getting picked up by the police, even if they picked up the wrong person, if you are undocumented, can mean that you don't get out of jail. Instead, you get bused to a jail in Louisiana where you're held for 1 to 3 months before you're sent back to your country of birth. So what I see is a huge fear among both the undocumented population, the documented sort of Latino immigrant population, and the refugee population about deportation and about coming into contact with our criminal justice system. So from where I'm sitting, the things that need to happen are to decouple our criminal justice system from the immigration system. There are some things we can do and some things we can't because we live in Tennessee. But I think there are a lot of things that we can do as a community that our elected leaders can do that are not being currently done.
I'm curious whether that 90-day clock that Kassar talked about still applies.
I have a client sitting in jail right now who has been in this country since December 16th. His case managers told me, from a wonderful organization, which is vastly underfunded, told me, we can't case manage him anymore because as of 3 weeks ago, his 90th day hit. He has, you know. So yes, it does still apply. One of the things actually that I want to push for is we have got to fund our refugee resettlement agencies because these are the places that people go to, even 2-3 years down the line, when somebody has a problem, that's where they turn to. And that's where it is effective and efficient for them to turn to. And so they need to be able to disseminate information to people.
And I'll add on to that the goal of the refugee resettlement program is self-sufficiency. So that's why, as Kassar mentioned, you have to pay back your airline ticket. You only get case management for a certain amount of time unless there's a really specific challenge within your case, and then there is intensive case management. But I think that's why the organizations like JFON and Connexion and Turk and the work that Mary Catherine does and the resettlement agencies play such a crucial role in this because the resettlement agencies can't do it alone. And it really takes a whole community to help refugees integrate successfully and immigrants. So to add on to what Mary Catherine said, I want to be clear that there's a vast spectrum of challenges that refugees and immigrants face. So even refugees themselves, you're going to have some very low-skilled refugees coming from a camp with no formal education, no underground education system like Kassar mentioned. You're going to have really high-skilled refugees who were surgeons in their home country, and either that certification doesn't transfer here or they don't speak a word of English, right? So they're a surgeon who can't even begin to really imagine going to medical school. And the same goes with immigrants. So in Nashville, about 40% of our immigrant population is undocumented. So undocumented immigrants have a completely different set of challenges than those immigrants who come here with some sort of legal status. So I do think it's just important to make that sort of distinction. But one thing that I will say that I've seen kind of across the spectrum, a challenge that refugee and immigrant communities face is not being able to be together. So I think that a lot of immigrants and refugees come from collectivist backgrounds and rely on each other so much for everything from childcare to transportation to work. And when Nashville becomes a city that really, you know, I don't even know if I can afford it if I hadn't bought a house 2 years ago working at a nonprofit. We're seeing these families and communities get displaced. And when that happens, they lose that social network. So that's a really tremendous challenge that refugee and immigrant communities are facing when they rely on each other so heavily.
So I'll reiterate some of that. I think some of the challenges that immigrants, so the work that I do at Conexión Américas is primarily with Latino families and particularly with students in the education system. But I will say what we see is that when families move here, like Julio's family, they lose an entire kinship network. And so in the Latino community, families, decisions are made as a family, including moving to this country. And so when you lose that kinship network, it can be really difficult for the family in lots of different ways. And so we see challenges that this community faces that's not unlike other communities that live in poverty, where you have limited access to mental health care. And so we have traumatic border crossing experiences. We have family separation, reunification issues. We have lots of issues related to, we see in the schools with generational issues, where families come with norms about gender and behavior and how young people behave and how they engage socially, and then the messages from American teenage world is very, very different. So that creates conflict in the household. We also see where there's a lack of the I will say that the families that we work with, the reason they came here was for their children's education, hands down. Right? And so their aspiration is for their children to go as far as they can go, but they don't know how to get them there. And so they feel powerless when they don't speak English, when the schools are not welcoming, when the schools don't have staff that speak their language. And at some point, there's a power shift where the student speaks more English than the parent, like Kazar. And assuming that a child is well-behaved and high-achieving, that works out. But if they're not, the power switches to the child. And then parents feel helpless and powerless and sometimes embarrassed that they've lost control of the situation in the home. And so this creates a lot of dynamics where we need mental health professionals, we need counselors in the school, we need bicultural staff in lots of settings. And so I would say that's a huge, tremendous need. So this sense of lack of connectivity, of isolation sometimes, and then this disenfranchisement, and I don't mean just with voting, but in terms of not having a way to address issues of housing discrimination, employment discrimination, right? There's no venue for that, especially if you're undocumented. And so those things also lead to this sense of isolation. But I will say that it's an incredibly resilient community, and their children are incredibly resilient. And now, like Julio, they're going to college, they are graduating, they are mobilizing, they're raising their voices. It's really an inspiring time to be in Nashville, to be part of that community.
I'm just curious, how deficient are we in ESL in schools? I mean, what's the percentage, if you know?
So I will tell you that 27% of the students in metro schools are Latino. People don't realize that number. Half of those students, it's about 18,000 students, are in elementary school. So the bubble is on the low end. And so what we have is the vast majority of our students that are English learners, what we call sometimes ELL, sometimes ESL, are in elementary grades. They exit ESL typically by fourth grade, third grade, fourth grade. Long-term English learners are less common. English learner students outperform metro school students by and large by middle school for lots of different reasons. And so, but if they come in at the teenage years, it's a much harder transition, see higher dropout rates. We've made progress in the instructional side. We have work to do there. We have work to do in general in this community and welcoming students and families from different backgrounds. But we've come a long way.
So, to the question, what are the daily challenges that immigrants face? Kasar and I are the same age. When I was, wow, I just gave myself away. When I was 8 and 10 years old, I had a completely different experience. growing up in Gallatin, Tennessee. Julio and I share a similar experience in that when I turned 16, I was unable to drive as well, but that was an executive order from my parents because they caught me driving someone else's car without a license. So these issues that I faced in my life that are entirely dissimilar from the experiences that others have faced, they're exacerbated when you take into consideration that a person who is undocumented, who comes into contact with the criminal justice system, will be separated from their family for the rest of their lives, that there might be a permanent bar that prevents them from seeing their loved one, that they might have to make a decision between leaving their spouse here in the United States or going to say their last goodbyes to their parents. The punishment is never equal to the crime when you take into consideration what some of the minor infractions that our immigrant and refugee neighbors face. And a lot of it comes down to cultural sensitivity, the attitudes that our criminal justice system has towards immigrants and refugees. So at Justice for Our Neighbors, what we do is we provide humanitarian immigration legal services for individuals. We have almost 200 individuals on our docket right now who are waiting for something called a U visa. And this is something for undocumented immigrants who have been victims of violent crimes who participate in the investigation and prosecution of a violent crime, where they've been a victim or a witness to this crime. They can work with law enforcement in order to put the bad guys away or deport the bad guys. And in return, they get a passport to freedom. They get a visa that will lead to a green card that will allow them to be here, to settle here, to travel to and from their home countries freely without the fear of deportation or a permanent ban preventing them from coming back. There are only 10,000 of those U visas available per year, and there are more than 120,000 people waiting on those right now. So it's an issue of public safety right now, where immigrants and refugees are in high crime neighborhoods because they're unable to afford better housing, better neighborhoods, or because that's where their community exists currently. They're cleaning up their neighborhoods by reporting these violent crimes. They're putting themselves at risk. And yet our attitude is that we're only going to give 10,000 of these away because you're not really doing us a favor. We're doing you a favor. It's the attitude of our criminal justice system. It's the attitude of our Congress and many people in our communities right now, that we're doing you a favor. But if we consider America the home of the free and the land of the brave, a story like Kassar's is certainly one that is evidence of bravery that we want to celebrate here in the United States. And it contributes greatly to the fabric of what we think of when we think of American freedom. The challenges that they face are attitudes in our criminal justice system and from our neighbors, and some of the policy changes that we can advocate for at a local level is encouraging our local police departments to continue issuing U certifications to people who are helping keep their community safer, keeping Nashville safer. In some of the surrounding counties, there are police departments that don't even issue these U certifications that are vital in order to obtain a U visa. And then advocating for Congress to increase the number of U visas that are available per year. We have clients who have been with us for 10 years waiting for a U visa. They've been instrumental in prosecuting a crime that is violent in nature and that has put others at risk, and they risk their own lives to go to law enforcement in order to keep themselves and their families safe. So I think we should reward that, and I think our elected officials could do a lot more in recognizing the bravery and the courage of our immigrant neighbors and refugee neighbors.
Has that 10,000 number increased or decreased in decades?
It's been the same since 1998 when it was first established.
Can I bring
Well,
that, I'm sorry,
sure.
just real quickly, can I bring that back locally? So I had a woman in my office today who is charged with domestic violence. Her husband hit her and she fended back. She called the police and she ended up getting arrested. And as she was telling me the story of how she called the police, my first thought was, well, why the hell would you do that? Okay? And to be honest, that is the rational decision for her. She was like, well, I wanted him to know that he couldn't do this again. But she will never call the police again. And I speak to people all of the time who do not because of the fear. Because for her, she was lucky. She was able to get out of jail without paying bond fairly quickly. Had she been in jail for about 12 more hours, she probably would still be there and would be, again, sent to Louisiana, separated from her 3-year-old child, and sent back to Honduras. So on a local level, there are three things. One is our police needs to be very clear about the lines they draw. They have not been clear at all about when they will or will not contact immigration. The second is further pressuring of our sheriff to limit his cooperation with ICE. ICE is the deporting force, basically. Yes, that is to some degree controlled and limited by our state legislature, but our sheriff's office could do more. They currently do have some affirmative outreach to ICE, which should not happen. The third thing is that the largest, or the primary way that that any immigrants, and especially undocumented people, get caught up in the criminal justice system is through the heinous crime of driving. Because, as Julio mentioned, if you aren't documented, you can't get a driver's license. Many of my clients have insurance even, but they can't get a license. And so our city locally could do more to encourage not arresting people, but giving them citations for driving without a license, especially if they have insurance. There's actually a proposal that has been put up, which now currently our elected judges are putting the brakes on, to allow people with citations for driving without a license to be diverted out of the system, meaning that they don't have to get booked in. Because when they get booked in, their fingerprints get sent to the feds, they get sent to ICE. If you've ever had any problems, boom, it's a red flag. I can't tell you how often I tell my clients, do you still live at this address? My advice is that you move. So those are some very concrete things which could happen in our community, which would increase the feeling of safety. Because the one thing that I think everyone in this community feels is fear.
We reported with great fanfare the end of 287G, which, allowed the locals. It's not gone, is it?
Oh, 287G is technically gone. Actually, the current
But the
situation
practice.
is worse. Yeah.
Okay. We hear every day that, 100 people a day are moving to Nashville? So if we forecast ahead 10 or 20 years, what does that mean for this population that's already struggling? I mean, do we have the vision and the planning and the capability to keep up?
Sorry, I'm a criminal defense attorney. I'm not an optimist. I will say, one thing that I wish more of our community saw, so I grew up in Houston, and then I spent my formative years in San Francisco and New York. I moved to Nashville 15 years ago, and I didn't even take the law licensing thing here, because there was no way I was staying in Tennessee, right? I was going back to California. And I'm still here. Part of that is because this community has become a community that I want to live in. And a big part of that is the diversity. It matters to me if I can get good Ethiopian food. I'm not living in a place where I can't get it. Sorry, Fargo would not be the place for me. But there are, so much of what is drawing people to Nashville is our diversity, our international communities. So I wish we had more sort of public recognition of how many of our most marginalized people are also what help increase our cachet and make us an attractive place to be. So I guess that's the one sort of positive spin I can put on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What do you think about 10, 20 years from now? Are you optimistic?
So unlike Mary Catherine, I am an optimist, generally. I think we talk about this a lot in the immigrant rights movement. It's all about planting the seeds, right? So we have to plant the seeds now for what happens 20, 30 years from now. And right now, where those seeds are growing is not the best soil, I'll say. So Julio talked about his story of receiving DACA status back when he was 18, right? So when Julio graduates from Lipscomb as a mechanical engineer, he will lose his DACA status if there isn't a permanent solution passed, because right now Congress has failed to pass the DREAM Act. So people have been able to renew their DACA, but that's only for up to 2 years. So essentially more people aren't coming here necessarily without status, but people who are here are losing their status to be here because programs like DACA and TPS, temporary protected status, they're being taken away. So I think that we have to be really careful to ensure that there are policies that we don't have more and more people losing their status, because there are, as we've all been discussing, such negative consequences of that in terms of mental health. And if you've all heard of ACEs, I feel like everyone's talking about adverse childhood experiences right now. I mean, what's more of an adverse childhood experience than having a parent taken from you if they are driving without a license, right? But so kind of on the contrary, something that I am optimistic about is last Tuesday, I had the privilege of meeting with Mayor Briley, and he talked about the importance of Nashville's government looking a lot more like Nashville's residents. So 1 in 10 Nashvillians are foreign born, which is kind of crazy if you think about that. That's a lot of people. So I think that not only government leaders, but business leaders, school leaders, they're starting to understand that. So there's a lot more leadership development programs. Nashville has My City Academy, which it's in its 7th year right now, teaching new Americans all about metro services. So I think if we continue to invest in our immigrant and refugee communities, ensuring that they have the responsibility of making decisions that impact our policies and the way that our systems operate, and then cut off any sort of bad policy that makes it more challenging for people to be here, I'm incredibly optimistic about where our city is going.
So I'll say that our immigrant community here, if you grew up here, and I think a lot of people here have spent a long time here, I grew up here, Nashville is very different than the Nashville I grew up in. Back when I grew up here, there was a Chinese restaurant and there was an Italian restaurant, and that was about it on diverse food, and so, or maybe a Mexican restaurant in Lion's Head, maybe. And so, so Nashville has changed immensely, and this generation of immigrants Kazar is really the first generation. She wasn't born here, but she grew up here. She has children in our school system now. Her children are going to be like so many other immigrants, second, third, fourth generation immigrants across our country, in a Houston, in a New York, where they are going to come through our system. They're going to go to college, right? They're going to become professionals. We're going to start to see, which we don't have now, bilingual folks in social services, in the public sector, in the private sector. You will see, and if you are paying attention, you're seeing more and more of that across our city. Immigrants now live across our city. They don't just live in South Nashville anymore. Charlotte Park Elementary is 50% Latino, right? Madison Middle School is like 40% Latino, right? And so you have to know that all of these communities will be changed and shaped by these emerging communities. And so I'm very hopeful that this young generation is going to come through our system. And so these young children that I'm talking about that are in elementary school now, the vast majority of those children were born here. So yes, the DACA struggles and these struggles are intensely difficult, but those children, often the siblings of DACA recipients, will be able to access financial aid, go to college, have many more opportunities and choices, be able to vote, right? And so it will be a different place in 10 or 20 years from now in Nashville. I really believe that. And these are families that are going to stay here. Their children are going to stay here. They're going to grow up here, and they're going to work here, and they're going to contribute. And so I'm very hopeful about that generation. And in the meantime, we have some really difficult work to do to protect their older siblings and their parents.
I feel like we have the bookends of pessimism here, because I'm going to paint a bleaker picture here. Full disclosure, Mary Catherine serves on the board of Justice for Our Neighbors, and I'm the executive director. So maybe it stems from our experience there. But if you look at the national and the state legislative environment, you see a lot of hostility towards immigrants and refugees, but by and large, major metropolitan areas are very welcoming to these communities. They drive our economy. They provide us with great cultural experiences and fanfare, and it's just a wonderful experience to be in a large city that has a thriving immigrant population. It's exciting. And so cities, by and large, respect and value that. And I think we're fortunate now in Mayor Briley, who does understand that as well. When you look at the national environment, I think if we continue to separate what we do here in the city from what happens at the state legislature or in Congress, and you can blame gerrymandering or you can blame any number of things, but as those two experiences get further separated, I think what you'll see in 10 to 20 years is this bunker mentality where immigrant and refugee communities are concentrated in major metropolitan areas. Can you imagine being an immigrant or refugee living in some of the smaller communities in and around Tennessee and how isolating that can feel, especially when you have to assimilate in 90 days, especially when you are seeking services for a traumatic experience that you may have experienced crossing the border or in childhood. In some of our suburbs, they're poorly under-equipped. They're not equipped at all to deal with ESL classes for students whose first language is Farsi. And any number of languages that you can think of. Our state doesn't address that issue. And at the national level, it's not being addressed either. So I think our cities do a good job to respect and value that. And I think in 10 to 20 years, unless we address that inequality, whether it's at the ballot box or through legislation, I think there will just be a concentration of immigrants in the cities, and everyone outside of the cities will feel very isolated and alone.
I'm glad you brought up the legislature. If you were going to give them a grade at this point, what would it be? And secondly, what can the folks out in the crowd tonight, what things should they lobby for that are realistic and
Statewide, you mean?
yes,
or local?
statewide?
So again, back to the beginning pessimism. I mean, realistically, I think what we need to do is we need to take back the legislature, right? I mean, the people who are there now are never going to get us what our community needs. And I think it is quite interesting that there seems to be such animus towards both immigrants and towards Nashville, because the two and the success of the two go hands in hand. So I was trying to think about this on the way up here. I'm like, ooh, I don't have much to say. I guess the two things I would say is, I mean, Nashville is growing, and we are spreading out into the outer counties. I tell my clients, don't leave Davidson County if you don't have to, and please don't get arrested outside of Davidson County, because it's so bad. But we have to also take responsibility, especially for our surrounding counties, because more and more they are part of the larger community in which we live. I think it is incumbent upon all of us. I mean, this model of the Blue Island, we can't keep going with this. So I think we all have to take responsibility for reaching out to our colleagues, our community members, the people we know who live in the surrounding areas, and help, person by person, help those become, if not blue, at least purple. Spaces so that we can have a state government that represents all of us, and not just the rural folks. The one other thing that I want to piggyback on briefly from the earlier question that Ginny said is, so many of these kids, as she talked about, are growing up. They're not going anywhere. Mm-hmm. But what do you think happens if we send their parents somewhere else? So part of protecting the future of Nashville and the future of these children is keeping them with their parents. Which means, again, on a local level, as much as we can, helping people avoid the criminal justice dragnet that pulls apart families. I mean, we've seen with African American communities, right? Ripping apart families, incarcerating parents doesn't help. It just can make, generation after generation of poverty. We have a community now where we're sort of given that choice. What are we going to do? And I think the Kurdish community is a fantastic example of what all of our immigrant communities could look like in the future if we give them that chance.
So I came from the state legislature today, actually, so I'm feeling a little bit exhausted. And I was there last Tuesday with Julio. So to grade, I don't even know. I think it's too soon to tell, actually. But I will grade, and I'm here obviously representing the Tennessee Immigrant and Refugee Rights Coalition, but I will grade our policy team, which I am not a part of, so I'm not a policy expert, and the immigrant and refugee communities who have organized around issues, I will give them an A+. Mm-hmm. They have been amazing. So just today, actually, at 5 o'clock, I got a breaking news alert on our Slack thread that we killed yet another anti-immigrant bill. So that's really, really encouraging. So so we've seen multiple anti-sanctuary city bills introduced this year. One of them is still being read. We have seen anti-tuition opportunity bills. So that's essentially what we are trying to do, Julio mentioned, with our tuition opportunity campaign that would make colleges and universities really accessible to undocumented students by allowing them to pay in-state tuition, not asking for any sort of public benefit, no financial aid, nothing like that, just to pay the same amount as their peers. So bills that are going against that. And we've seen a really awful consular ID bill that would prohibit anyone from using their consular ID in any sort of formal setting. So if someone is undocumented, they oftentimes rely on a passport or a consular ID to enroll their kids in school, right? So for various things where you need some formal ID, you would no longer be able to use that. So it's just an incredibly disenfranchising policy. So yes, we are fighting against all of these, but another really exciting victory that some of you may have heard about or been following is back in 2016, Senator Mark Norris led a campaign to sue the federal government to stop refugee resettlement in the state of Tennessee. So Governor Bill Haslam didn't sign it. He said this is not a good idea. Our Attorney General, Herbert Slattery, said, I don't actually think that this has legal merits. I'm not going to represent you. They went ahead and found a law firm out of Michigan to take up the case. Turk intervened along with 2 resettlement agencies in Tennessee. And just yesterday, a federal judge ruled that there was not legal merit to the case, and it was dismissed. So that was pretty remarkable, right? Yeah, way to go. The courts have been saving everyone recently. But it was really remarkable because today was our last week was Tuition Opportunity. Today was Refugee Day on the Hill. So we had over 50 refugees from across the state representing so many countries. We had Syria, Bosnia, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Vietnam. And they met with their legislators, including Senator Mark Norris. They shared their stories and asked them not to appeal the ruling. So time will tell whether or not our leaders make the decision to appeal this case or not, but we're really optimistic. So to take action, I don't want to talk for too long. I encourage you, if you don't get Turk's emails, we have an email sign up on the back. We're really good about not sending too many emails, but when we have a really important call to action, like right tomorrow, we need you to call Speaker Harwell and ask her not to appeal the bill, we will call upon you to do that. We also have some one-pagers about the Tuition Opportunity Campaign, so I highly encourage all of you to call your representative and your senator and let them know that you're in favor of that passing. The next vote on it in the House Education Committee should be next Tuesday.
Who paid the Michigan firm?
Who paid the Michigan firm? I want to say that they donated their time, I think. Did we pay? I don't remember.
I'm not sure.
I don't know. That's a really good question.
Should get a good investigative reporter.
Yeah, we should. We should. I know that they had been farming it. So the Michigan firm, they're essentially a hate group. They really wanted to take it on, so I wouldn't be surprised if they did it pro bono. Don't quote me on that, though.
So I think I'll say 2 things. One, I'll say obviously register to vote, make your voice heard. It's surprising the very small number of people that actually reach out to elected officials, that visit elected officials, that go and visit them on the Hill. It's actually, one person can actually make a difference in that way. So then I'm going to go down a very wonky policy path here for a second, and so talk about education policy. So I think in the state legislature, you can have the same legislator get an F on an issue and an A on an issue. So Senator Todd Gardenhire from Chattanooga gets an A on sponsoring a bill to support tuition equality, right, for undocumented students. He gets an F for sponsoring a bill to have a suburb of Chattanooga secede from the public school system. And we know who lives in that particular district, right, that neighborhood. He gets an A and an F. So we have to applaud him, and then we have to turn around and shame him, right, for doing these kinds of secessionist moves in public education. So I'll say that 2015, Congress passed the Every Student Succeeds Act, which replaced No Child Left Behind. Most people have heard of No Child Left Behind. Most people have not heard of Every Student Succeeds Act. It's called ESSA for short. And so every state, including Tennessee, had to write a state plan based on this new federal law. And so we organized, Conexión America's policy team organized with civil rights groups across the state, NAACP, urban leagues, refugee resettlement groups, immigrant serving groups, youth serving groups, and we pushed the State Department of Ed to write a plan that was really equitable and good to all students. And Tennessee's plan is recognized as one of the best plans in the country in terms of how it ensures that the accountability framework is good for all students. And I'll give you an example of that. The federal law requires that every state is rated on how well English learners are learning English. So not how well English learners are doing on math and reading, but how well they're learning English. So that information has never been publicly released. It's very hard to find, it's very hard to get a hold of, how any given school, how well those immigrant students are progressing on their English. So Tennessee, we pushed Tennessee in many ways to make sure that that rating counted. It's 10% of a school's grade. So if any school in Tennessee has 10 or more English learner students, then 10% of their grade, and the other thing you don't know is every school this fall is going to get a letter grade, A through F letter grade, every public school. 10% of that grade is how well English learners are being served. That's really important. That's really important. That's the difference between an A and a B or D and an F. And so what we are applauding the state and saying now you need to equip districts and schools to serve these students well. But you also have to make sure that these students aren't pushed out or not enrolled or their families shamed if a school gets an F, because they'll get a grade for each of the measures on how well they're serving those kids. But the good news is that that information now is public. We know which schools are serving immigrant students well, and how are they doing that, and what are they doing, and which schools have some work to do. So so the state legislature has approved this plan, right? And they've adopted it wholesale and are moving forward. And so this, for me, is, as an educator, I think education is one of the fundamental ways that we ensure our immigrant community thrives, and that is if they're in good schools with good teachers every day. And so I think this plan is one way to get at that.
I'm going to sound like a pessimist and a partisan now, so I wouldn't necessarily give our state legislature an A or an F on their issues dealing with immigrants and refugees. I would just say they didn't complete the course, because they're not taking seriously what is at the root cause of the issues affecting our immigrant communities. They're not culprits. As Donald Trump said in his announcement speech, he thinks that a majority of them are criminals, and a few of them are good people. It is vastly different from the reality that he lives in. And I think the reality that our state legislature lives in is vastly different. And so they don't take seriously that many immigrants and refugees are victims. And they have survived, and they have thrived despite all odds. And so I would urge them, and I would urge anyone who's voting, to take seriously what our immigrant population faces, because we can learn a great deal from them. And I think we can benefit from their strength coming into our community, working and learning alongside our students and our employees. I think it benefits us. So the state legislature knows that the foreign-born population of Tennessee is around 10 to 11%. The number of undocumented people in the state, the number of refugees in the state, they're not eligible to vote, and so they're not their constituency that they're concerned with. But I think, as everyone here has said, our success is dependent upon their success as well. When we all succeed, we all succeed. So I think it's important that our state legislatures take that to mind, and that we do tell them, our local representatives and senators, that we care about the immigrant and refugee community.
Q&A time.
Okay, so I just passed up the one question we got. If anyone did not get a note card and wants to ask one, I've got a bunch here, and we will collect them in a minute, so just put your hand up.
Ooh, this is an interesting question, a good one. What makes some people who were immigrants themselves, Cubans, Jews, not welcoming to the next group?
I'll speak to that as a Cuban American. Immigrant communities, all communities are, just because Cubans are immigrants doesn't mean they're not without bias on race, on class, on nationality. The Cubans that have come to this country, by and large, are white, right? And they were highly educated, and they came here, and they thrived, right? Including my own family. And so there is this sort of us and them mentality, right? The story of Mexicans is different than our story somehow. And we got here and we're closing the door behind us, frankly, mostly. And so it is related to race, it's related to class, it's really, and it's unfortunate, right? I would say that there is more of a pan-Latin identity in this country than when I was growing up. When I was growing up, the term Latino, that term didn't exist, right? And so there is more of a sense of we have more in common than we don't. But I would say with my parents' generation, that is just not the case.
And I would challenge that assertion somewhat, right? I think that we would be naive to say that that does not exist, and I completely understand what Jeannie was speaking to. But I also think that there's so much support within immigrant and refugee communities of each other, and I think that was really exemplified today at the Day on the Hill when we had, as I said, about 50 refugees from across the state representing so many different backgrounds. I mean, I can't even begin to tell you the stories that I heard. I'm still processing everything. And we had group leaders, and most of our group leaders were DACA recipients or immigrants from other countries, who didn't come through the refugee resettlement process. And our messaging was, we don't just want you to accept refugees here. This is coming from the Congolese refugee who came here a year and a half ago. He said, we want Tennessee to be welcome to all immigrants and refugees. So I do think that there is more of a welcoming front than you may realize.
Well, and I'd like to add that I think a big part of that, frankly, goes to organizations like Turk. I mean, organizations, so it's not just siloed organizations that serve specific individual communities, but I mean, Turk is the Immigrant and Refugee Rights Coalition. And so they do serve not just the community, Latino community, not just the Muslim community, not just the Kurdish community, but all communities. And I think frankly, that's part of the big success that we've had here in Nashville is these communities joining hands. I mean, as Jeannie said, it's the same, frankly, as the rural folks who voted for Trump, and he ain't doing them no favors, okay? But they want to see themselves as part of that group, not part of the other group. And so, the strategy of dividing, it has been there forever. And in order to move forward, I think we need to continue supporting the work of Turk and uniting of these communities and uniting with other communities that have similar interests. The African American community and the Latino community both face very similar treatment by police, issues in the criminal justice system, and are two communities that have historically been at odds, that are encouraged to be at odds. So I think it is human nature to want to separate yourself from the others. Oh, I'm not like them. Mm-hmm. But I think that our success, all of our success, depends on building these bridges within immigrant communities and between them and other like-minded or like-needed communities.
Who's here tonight? How many immigrants in the crowd? Which generation? How many first generation Americans? Okay. How many second generation Americans? How many who think they're Native American? Interesting. Another good question, how can we build power by intersecting immigrant issues with other marginalized communities? We
just answered it.
Kind of answered it really well.
I would reiterate the education issue, right? I think that a really, really good education should be delivered to every single child, right? No matter what zip code, no matter where they live. And so that is an issue where you do see communities come together. It's much harder on things like labor. Mm-hmm. Labor is where Black and brown communities fall apart. It's just too contentious. But I would say in education, you do see where groups come together with common cause around issues around discipline, around teachers, mm-hmm. Around funding, around zoning, around choice. It's interesting to see where communities will intersect on some issues.
Are friendships among children bringing adults clarity?
Yeah, I think so. Kazar can speak to this.
Yeah, absolutely. So I work at Valor Digital Academies, and it's a school that's been intentionally designed to reimagine integration.
And at Valor, what's been phenomenal is that because it's so diverse, and we look at diversity as like an ocean of human differences, these kids are becoming friends, and they're becoming, sources of knowledge for each other. It's actually forcing their parents to connect as well. I'll give you an example of right after actually presidential elections. It shook the rest of the United States, but it also shook Valor. We've had where one family member, strongly conservative Republican, found out that her daughter is best friends with a Kurdish liberal democratic family, and she was outraged, but then wanted to get to know the family, and so she invited the Kurdish family over to her house. And they had some tough, courageous conversations, but both families now went from having a bunch of misconceptions about each other into now understanding, like now that family actually became a very prominent advocate to fight against like this, all these anti-refugee bills that is actually quite depressing in a way. Having to go through the immigration system, I learned that our current immigration system is extremely a racist institution. We actually favor European Christians. Those families became connected because their kids were best friends. And they saw the humanity in each other and forced their parents to have conversations and to talk about societal issues. And so, yes, I do agree with you that as our kids are growing up together, and the most beautiful thing about children is they're so innocent, and they're extremely good at asking questions when they see unfair and unjust things. They are equipped to challenge the equity issues in all the systems that we have, including immigration, education, healthcare, transportation.
We need to bring them to the Hill.
I agree.
How can we educate the ignorant about the value of immigrants from a business perspective? Assets, not threats. What's being done to help qualified, educated, trained refugees to compete on an even level for jobs?
Well, just in terms of the assets, not threats, I want to touch back on something Wade said, which is this concept of immigrants as criminals. And I mean, our country has a long history of criminalizing the other, right? Criminalize our African Americans. I think you guys had the whole Jeannie Alexander series here. You're familiar with that concept. That's what we see happening now with our immigrant population. Very explicitly, the rhetoric is now changed to not just that they're poor or whatever, but they are criminals. These are criminals. They are threatening us. They are criminals. We see increasingly very small transgressions like driving without a license being given bigger penalties, especially for this group of people. And now I forgot where I started with this because I got started down that path. But so I think a big part of it is decriminalizing this. Studies show that the non-native born population, so non-American born people, commit crimes at a lower rate, okay? And I was thinking about this as we're listening to the stories about the bomber this morning. All these shootings, I mean, the majority of them are white men. I keep wanting to put on Facebook, which I don't use, but, all this thing about let's shut our borders. If you really want to get rid of the culprits, we need to just cut out all of the men.
Right?
Now, obviously,
I'm
we
the
would never
biggest
do
threat
that,
on the stage?
but that is
What
the
is
common
wrong with
thread.
men?
Okay? I mean, if we're looking for common threads, that's the common thread. So, at any rate, really, I don't know how much people react to statistics, but statistics show this is not the group that is hurting us.
And I would also say about educating the ignorant, storytelling has a dramatic impact on people's perceptions of immigrants. Kasar and Julio's stories were terrific. And we have 200 clients on our U visa docket, each with a unique story about how they helped law enforcement solve a crime, keep their community safe. There's stories of families who were torn apart, but against all odds came back together because of their love for one another and their value for family. There's stories of individuals whose sons were murdered by the Taliban, and then they received awards from the State Department for acts of valor on the battlefield in the service of the United States of America. And we shouldn't take for granted that the things that our president is saying right now, like we need to revoke the visa lottery, like we need a merit-based immigration system. Those are things that we've come to accept from him as, oh, okay, yeah, maybe we can do that, because everything else that he's saying is so terrible that we give him a mulligan on that. But those are horrible ideas, because there are people who have come on the visa lottery who have saved American soldiers' lives. There are people here who are here who didn't come on merit-based scholarships, but they've created Fortune 500 companies. And so I don't think we should take for granted that the power of immigrant and refugee stories can change people's hearts and minds, and that's what we really want to do.
I'll give you a little advice when you're dealing with news media, because they'll jump on the story of the immigrant criminal. I think every time you see one of those, bombard newsrooms with a couple of your opposite examples.
Yeah,
Because-
I mean,
and make it easy for them. Say, we'll have the person here at 12 noon, and you can talk to them, and we'll have
we're in a
pictures and-
difficult position because we have attorney-client privilege, so we cannot share many of those stories with the person's name. But
Could
if-
you do it generically?
yeah, generically, or with the person hidden behind a screen. Yeah.
Sure. Just a suggestion.
Thank you.
I want to just share an anecdote. So there is a guy who lives in Hendersonville who is a Republican. He's a nice guy. He's an architect. And he went to Hendersonville High School to look for some high school students that would intern and help him with some projects, because they had a drafting architecture program. And he had a student, a Latino student, raise his hand and said, I really want to do it, and you don't have to pay me. I'll do it. And he's been coming every Saturday for 2 years to help this guy. And it has completely changed his worldview on undocumented immigrants, on recipients of DACA. This young man applied and got into the UT Architecture School, which is the only architecture school in the state. It's very, very competitive. He's undocumented. He can't go because he can't pay out-of-state tuition. And so he got in touch with me. You know, people say, hey, you should talk, you know, people connect the dots. And I said, aren't you in Diane Black's district? Right? And he said, she goes to my church. And then we set up a meeting, and her staff met with this student. She wouldn't meet with them. But that was his moment of advocating on an issue that would have never occurred to him before. And that's the power of personal relationships, the parents that get together. That's what it's going to take is people coming together in a situation that it seems natural, right? And then all of a sudden you're willing to take a chance on them, for them, right?
Here's one that we've kind of covered, but we can always have more suggestions. How can we help? What is the greatest need?
So I'm going
I didn't know if you were pointing to me or not. Okay.
Next week, I think NOAA is having a judicial candidate forum. We have judicial elections coming up. Our general sessions judges, all 11 of them, are elected in shockingly low turnout races. They matter. Our sheriff matters. So we need, and they are very concerned about getting reelected. So they are very responsive to calls, to emails, to personal visits. So I encourage you, if you know, especially within the criminal justice system, let the judges know that you value immigrants and you would like to know what they can do to help protect our immigrant neighbors from those horrible federal agents who are tearing apart families.
I completely agree with that, and it's 2018. It's a big election year, so one of the really most powerful things you can do is yourself vote or register others to vote. I know that there were some Hume Fogg high school students doing that, so that's amazing to see high school students taking leadership on that issue. At Turk, we're doing a lot of work to get out the vote in the refugee and immigrant community, and we have lots of volunteer opportunities around that. So if you're interested in volunteering to help with that, you can find me afterwards, shoot me an email if our contact information is, I don't know if it's on the brochure or not, but I'm sure we'll get in touch somehow. But really one of the biggest things that you can do, should do, is what you're doing here tonight. So that's to educate yourself on the issues, and then go ahead and educate others, and use your pulpit. Right, so I could not be more grateful to Rabbi Mackler for not only bringing this into the temple tonight, and to Daniel, but for being a voice when we ask her to come speak at a vigil for the Muslim ban, right? So that is huge, and I see another faith leader back here. So I know that there are other faith leaders who are outspoken on these issues, and that's so, so important. And then one of my favorite ways to help is really just find that nonprofit that speaks to you the most and just get super involved with them. And that looks totally different at different agencies. But I would say if you're looking to get involved, make that a really big commitment, make it a really big part of your life. People love to give and to be helpful, to give back in a time like this. So I would say if there's any part of you that's like, oh, I want to do more, but I don't have time or I don't have resources, just go for it. Just like dive in, do more, and you'll feel really